Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Did you ever guess in your early career you would be what you are today? I mean, you are a distinguished scholar, practitioner. You've accomplished much. The folks at DePaul have you on a pedestal, and rightfully so. Did you ever think, coming from Egypt in 1962, that this sort of what is your calling?
Well, I never thought I would ever leave Egypt. Coming from sort of a patrician family on both sides, father and mother, with a grandfather on the one side who was president of the Senate and president of the Bar Association, and the other grandfather, also a lawyer, who was general counsel for the Royal Palace. My father was an ambassador, every member of my family had high position. So I never really thought I would leave Egypt, and I saw my future sort of following in the footsteps of my two famous grandfather lawyers. So coming to the States was totally unexpected. It was something that I had to do, and so when I found myself here, I had to pursue a career in law, except that I had never thought it would be an academic law, and I suppose I was always more inspired by my paternal grandfather, who was a practicing criminal defense lawyer, and so that led me, in addition to being an academic, to have a sort of a second life, and that of an activist in the defense of human rights.
When you left Egypt, was that during the Nasser era there?
That's right, yes. Yeah, the Nasser regime was still there, and it was a very oppressive regime that was a dictatorship, and so it didn't agree with me, and I didn't agree with it.
Did it affect did your mom and dad and everybody else leave too, or?
No, my parents were divorced when I was a young kid. My mother came and resettled in the U.S. and remarried and lived in California, and my father continued to live in Egypt. And in fact, the reason I left Egypt is my mother had cancer, and I'm an only child, so I decided to be with her in her last few days or few years.
You've been in Chicago for an extended period of time. Why there?
Well, this is one of those very fortuitous things. When I came to the States, my mother introduced me to her attorney in New York, who was a well-known transactional lawyer, and she had property in New York that he took care of, and I think he wasn't too happy with having to take me out for dinner and counsel me, but he took me to his club, which was the Harvard Club in New York, and as we went into the club, he saw another friend of his from the New York bar who was eating dinner with another gentleman that he probably had to take out for dinner. He didn't look too happy, so they looked at each other and they recognized that, and they said hello to each other and said, well, why don't we sit all together? And so we sat all together, and my host said, well, you know, this young man is coming from Egypt, he has a law degree, and he's thinking of going to law school, and somebody said maybe he should go to Harvard, and he's thinking of it, and he probably doesn't want to go to Harvard. And so the other Harvard grad who was there at the Harvard Club said, why don't you want to go to Harvard? And I said, well, actually, I was admitted because I had sent my papers in. But the tuition is very high, and while my mother could afford to pay for it, I didn't want to start my life in this country by sort of being beholden to her for paying my tuition. And I thought, well, I'll shop around, see if I can get a law school that will take me in without having to pay that tuition. By total fortuitous reasons, the guest of the other lawyer happened to be the dean of Indiana University.
I'll be there.
And he turned around and he said, well, if you're admitted to Harvard, we'll sure admit you at Indiana University. Would you like to come? And I said, yes, but I can't afford it. He said, we'll give you a tuition waiver. So, or a fellowship, whatever it was called. So you know, totally without knowing where Indiana was, I landed in New York, and from there I wound up in Indiana and went to law school there and worked during the day and went to school at night. And then one day I was a member of the law fraternity called Phi Alpha Delta, and went to Chicago for a big meeting and met a few law professors there at DePaul. And they said, hey, why don't you join us? And I have to tell the story because it's so cute. One of the professors who recruited me after they did, and I said, well, you know, I mean, you guys basically don't know anything about me, you know. I'm just, as far as I'm, you know, I'm literally off the boat. I've been here for 2 years, and yes, I'm graduating, and yes, I have a law degree from Cairo. It sounds good on paper, but this is a big responsibility to hire somebody to teach. I'm telling that to the dean and to the chairman of the recruiting committee. And I said, you have to tell me, why did you do that? Well, the chairman of the recruiting committee was born and bred in the Midwest, and he traveled along the trails of the wagon trains for years, and that was his hobby. And he was very folksy in his way, and so he used to smoke a cigarette, and he tapped the cigarette on his finger, and he said, well, let me tell you, my son. He said, there used to be a story on the wagon trails that when the wagon trails would reach California, they would stop at a certain place, and then the wagon train would break up, and people would go in different directions. And there'd be a fellow come and walk through the wagon trains, and he'd stop and he'd say, well, Greg, where do you come from? And Greg would say, well, I come from White Plains, New York. And he'd say, well, how is it there? And Greg would say, oh, it's horrible. People are difficult, and the weather is bad, and I couldn't get along with my neighbors and whatnot. And the man would say, you know what, Greg? You ought to just keep on going for a few more miles. You know, you'll find a few towns, you know, in the maybe about 10, 15 miles, and you'll find one that's settled. Or he would find the Greg, and Greg would say, you know, I hated to leave White Plains. I had so many good friends, and my neighbors were great, and I have so great memories. And he'd say, Greg, why don't you come to our town?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said, I've talked to you for now a few hours, and you left behind you a trail of good memories and of pleasant memories, and I figure you must be a good person, and so we want you to join our town. So that's how I started teaching at DePaul. I started in 1964.
My gosh.
We're now in 2006, and I'm still there 43 years later.
Terrific. And well, obviously left a legacy, and probably as well known as the Myers, aren't you?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Your life with the United Nations obviously is pretty well documented, but for the video, how did you get exposed to that whole international criminal law process?
Well, it really started, I think, quite early. In 1968, I joined an organization in America called the International Association of Penal Law, the American branch. And I had just recently joined, and there was a big conference in Germany on extradition. And there were 5 people from the US slated to go, and I joined them as number 6. Well, lo and behold, all 5 of them couldn't make it. So I represented the US at this extradition conference. And, you know, I brushed a little bit on it, and I got there, and here were all of the big names in the world in international criminal law from all over the world. And I was very impressed, and don't ask me why, but there was one little issue that I honed on, which troubled me, in that all the literature up to the 60s, when it dealt with extradition, dealt with the person as an object. So it was the 2 governments, one shipping a human being to another. And it sort of wrinkled me, and I said, well, at the meeting, and I said, well, couldn't we substitute the word object with subject? Little did I know that this had been the object of a very significant doctrinal debate. And I found myself thrown into it, not knowing what it was all about. I thought it was such a simple thing.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe somebody made a mistake, you know. Why do you call a human being an object, you know? And before you knew it, I was championing the cause of human rights and became well known in the field, and especially in extradition, and wrote the book that the Supreme Court has cited repeatedly, and others. Anyway, so my beginning came out of there in '68, and then I was very lucky in 1970. The German professor at the University of Freiburg, where the conference was, invited me to be a Fulbright professor, which was very difficult in those days because there was a German commission that had to approve the guest, and an American commission. And I was very young. In '68, I'd been teaching for only 4 years. So there was no track record or anything. But I passed, and so 4 years after teaching, in my 5th year, I was already a Fulbright professor in Germany. Got a lot of exposure to international criminal law. Came back in 1969, stayed at DePaul for a year, and then in 1970, I was invited to go as a visiting professor at NYU, and they were recruiting me to go and teach there. The chair of the department, who was the head of the LLM in criminal justice, who was a dear friend and who now passed away, by the name of Gerhard Mueller, went on a sabbatical. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, but the dean, then McKay, turned over to me and said, "You're now running the LLM criminal justice program at NYU." So here I was a young kid, you know, running the program. And of course they did offer me a job, but my wife at the time didn't want to move to New York, so I had to make a personal choice. And the year later, I got tired of commuting and so went back to Chicago. Mm-hmm. Well, my good luck, I think, continued. The next year, I received a scholarship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and I spent a year at the Woodrow Wilson. So here, in a span of my first 7 years of teaching, I was a Fulbright professor, I was a Woodrow Wilson scholar, sure, and I was a visiting professor at NYU. So that got me started. In '75, I attended the first UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, and again, to my surprise, was elected vice president, and had some significant influence in it. And in '77, I was elected the co-chair of the drafting committee that drafted the Torture Convention, mm-hmm, which the UN adopted in '84. I continued in that line of work, and subsequent to that, I was the vice chairman of the ad hoc committee and then the preparatory committee of the General Assembly for the ICC, and then chair of the drafting committee, elected unanimously by 161 countries. And then I was appointed independent expert for the Commission on Human Rights on victim compensation, which I served for 4 years, mm-hmm, and then independent expert on human rights in Afghanistan, in which I served for 2 years. So I went through a number of UN positions, all of which were really very rewarding. And in the meantime, as you know, I was also the chairman of the Yugoslavia Commission that investigated war crimes in the former Yugoslavia between '92 and '94. And that was really the seminal point, not in my life, but in the history of international criminal justice. Right. Because after Nuremberg and Tokyo, there was nothing. Right. And the first time the UN addressed the issue of international criminal justice was with the Commission.
Why then? you know, there was such a span of time
Yeah.
where nothing was occurring. What realpolitik that you talked about today would have caused that particular one to be?
Well, I think basically what happened shortly after Nuremberg and Tokyo ended, by 48, the Cold War was in full session. You know, Berlin was surrounded by the USSR. We had to have, you know, the airlift into Berlin in order to feed the people of Berlin in the American zone. A few years later, by 51, we had the war in Korea. We had the weapons race, the atomic weapons race. All of that really meant that any efforts to create an international criminal court, to develop an international criminal code, had to be put on the back burner. Suddenly 1989 comes about, the Berlin Wall falls, a new era comes about. But I think what is quite significant is that during the campaign in the election of Bill Clinton made noises about having the U.S. intervene in the former Yugoslavia. The Bush administration, Father Bush in the last few days says, we're not getting involved in there. Colin Powell came up with his famous theory, you don't go in unless you know how you get out. Jim Baker said, you know, the Balkans is a quagmire. And so here's Clinton out on a limb. He gets elected. He sends Warren Christopher, Secretary of State, to NATO, and Christopher is of the opinion not to intervene. So he comes back and he said, listen, the French and the Brits are taking care of it, we stay out of it. And in the meantime, the situation gets worse, and the pictures are on everybody's television that, you know, here's Europe that has just seen Nuremberg, that just said never again, that had these terrible things on its picture. I mean, it was in the backyard of Europe. Basically, I think the Clinton administration didn't know what else to do. So if I can make the analogy, it's the same thing with Darfur. Instead of saying, you know what, we're going to send coalition troops from the United Nations to protect people, we say we're going to refer the matter to the International Criminal Court. So usually politicians, when they want to use international criminal justice, they want to use it because they don't have anything else to do. And they want to use that in order to convince the general public that they're doing something. So since the Clinton administration couldn't send troops into Bosnia to protect people, they said, oh, we'll prosecute the bad guys.
So you were part of this investigation team on the Yugoslavia crimes, and somehow your paths crossed with Richard Goldstone's.
Well, I was the chairman of the commission established by the Security Council, so I collected the evidence for 2 years. And then the Secretary General nominated me to be the first prosecutor. And England didn't like that, so they opposed me. And they felt that because I probably had done what I would consider a very solid job, that I would in effect be very effective from the beginning. And effectiveness was not a good idea because Lord David Owen of England was then negotiating with the parties to reach a political settlement. So you can't really have negotiations for political settlements going on at one hand and have a tribunal where you have a very vigorous prosecutor who is going to be prosecuting the people you're trying to negotiate with. So they were afraid that I would be an activist and, I would say, insensitive prosecutor. But frankly, that would not have been my style. I would have been uncompromising in that I would not have made political compromises, but I think I would have had the good judgment of knowing when to proceed and when not to proceed. And certainly if you have peaceful negotiations going on, you're not going to serve an arrest warrant on somebody who's negotiating for peace. You know, good judgment says, let them sign the peace agreement, settle on it. You know, you can choose your timing.
Right.
So long as you don't compromise the investigation, you gather the evidence, whether you prosecute today or in 6 months from now, that's not the point. Anyway, so the UK opposed it, and then at that point they changed the rules in the Security Council, and they insisted that the appointment be by consensus. They then picked up on somebody in Venezuela who basically told the UN people that he wasn't ready to go there for almost 6 to 8 months. And after 6 to 8 months, he said, gee, I changed my mind, I'm not accepting the job. So people ran around to try to find somebody, and you know, Goldstone was known to a few human rights activists in the US, and so he was nominated. So in comes Goldstone, and my job is finishing as chairman of the commission, and I'm supposed to turn over my evidence to him. So I reached out to him and told him who I was, and he said, well, I'm arriving in The Hague on Friday, and I said, well, I'll arrive on Sunday. So on Sunday I arrived, and I went out to dinner with him and his wife, and next day I was in his office. It was a barren white office, didn't even have a map of the former Yugoslavia. So I brought him my maps, and I gave him my database, which had 64,000 documents, 300 hours of videotapes, 3,000 pictures, briefed him extensively on the structure of the military, the nature of the conflict, and basically got him started.
Yeah. Were you also involved in Rwanda at all? I know
No.
you told the story, but that was...
Yeah. No, I had nothing to do with Rwanda. I was so much involved with the Yugoslavia Tribunal. I had really nothing to do with Rwanda, and my job was between 92 and 94. And just to give you an idea, in 2 years, we discovered the existence of 151 mass graves.
Mm-hmm.
We conducted the world's largest rape investigation. I and a team of 33 women, we interviewed 223 victims of rape. We collected 575 affidavits of women who were raped. We did the biggest study that was ever done on the targeting and shelling of Sarajevo for 3 years. In our report, we documented every shell fired every day. How many victims, how many people injured, how many people dead, where the targets fell. For example, I can tell you that in a period of 3 years, the civilian hospital in Sarajevo called Kosovo was hit 283 times.
Jeez.
I'll tell you something else that I discovered to my great surprise. I was one day visiting the hospital when it was being shelled, and it was about 1 o'clock. And I came back to the database office. We had a big operation. We had over 140 people working and collecting the data. And the head of the team looking into Sarajevo came over to see me and said, you know, it's a very strange thing. I don't know if our statistics are wrong, but 70% of the shelling of the hospital is between the hours of 12 and 2. And I said, yes, I think that's right. And he said, it doesn't make sense. Why would 70% be between the hours? What's so magic? And I said, well, it happened that I just came from there. It was 1 o'clock. The hospital was shelled. We all ran into the basement. And I asked the head of the hospital, I said, how is that the case? And he said, oh, they do that all the time. And I said, why? He said, because that's visitation time. The Serbs knew that because the hospital had no supplies, the families of the injured and the sick would come between 12 and 2 to bring them food, medicine,
Jeez.
you know, blankets, whatever it was, and that was their favorable time to shell. So we worked for 2 years to document the policy of ethnic cleansing. We We identified over 3,000 towns and villages that had been ethnically cleansed. We identified all of the places of detention, the mass graves around them, places where torture were being killed. And it was based on our report that the Security Council decided to establish the tribunal. Because until then, they didn't have the evidence, and they weren't going to do it unless they felt forced by the evidence. And so that's what happened.
Well, and from that tribunal, the Yugoslavia tribunal, others have followed, and
Yeah.
you're kind of the patriarch of that process when you think about it. Obviously, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1999 for your work at the International Criminal Court. What's Robert Jackson mean to Cherif Bassiouni?
Well, the way I always read about him and tracked him throughout his history is something that maybe will be difficult for people to understand. Mm-hmm. I saw him as the epitome of the Yankee common lawyer. Bright, person with integrity, capable, for whom the idea of the rule of law is so part of him, so natural, that the common law is what the common law is. Mm-hmm. He didn't have to philosophize it. He didn't have to raise it to, Gaelic levels of something that is extraordinary. It was simple. It was matter of fact. It was time-tested. It was the right thing to do. And I think he pursued that in his work at Nuremberg. The idea of providing a tribunal with a minimum of due process. He didn't have to philosophize about it. He didn't have to think twice about it. Yes, anybody who is being accused has the right to a defense, and he has the right to proper defense. He wasn't going to turn this into a kangaroo court. There was too much at stake. Without, and hopefully this will not sound too much political, but when you look at the people in this present administration, you have the feeling none of them have a feeling for the law. None of them have the sort of reverence, respect, belief of the law. It's not something they grew up with. They were, for them, the law is a game. It's a charade. Well, it was the same thing with Stalin. Stalin thought at Nuremberg this was going to be a game. It was going to be a charade. Mm-hmm. This was an opportunity to rewrite history. It's an opportunity to show the Nazis were the aggressors and make sure that the Molotov von Ribbentrop agreement on the invasion of Poland and the splitting in Poland between the two countries never came to surface. It was how do you cover up for the murder of 12,000 Polish officers in the Katyn forest and blame it on the Germans, mm-hmm. when in fact it was the Russians who did it. For the Russians, it was how do you manipulate justice? I think for Jackson, it was just totally from within him. Justice is justice. That's the way it has to be. If I can make an analogy, in 1600s in England, Lord Coke became the Lord Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas. And he took a very simple concept, which is an old rule of the courts of common pleas where the common people would go, that says that a person cannot testify against himself or herself. And he turned that into a principle. Mm-hmm. A principle that migrated in the United States, became a constitutional principle, a principle that from our Constitution went into numerous treaties and numerous other constitutions. Well, did Cook really think he was going to impact the history of law in the world with his position of a simple evidentiary rule on the privilege against self-incrimination? He didn't. But he reacted with a certain simplicity that went to the very heart of something meaningful to the rule of law. And that something grew. And I think that Jackson probably didn't know what the future was. He certainly couldn't contemplate what it would be. But he did what he thought was right. He did it with the conviction and the simplicity of somebody who has an inner feeling for the meaning of the rule of law, coming from centuries of traditions of the common law in which he believed. And as a result, he planted a seed that grew.
What's Cherif Bassiouni's legacy? You've done so much, you've accomplished, and so well respected, and obviously continue to be very active. But is there something where you'd say, gee, I hope when the day is done, somebody remembers me for this?
Honestly, I don't have that level of presumption in me. The one thing that I always tell myself is, one of these days I'm going to face my Maker, and I'd like to be able to say, you know, God, you've given me a lot in life. You've given me certain capacities and attributes, and I did the best I could.
And you have done much. And congratulations for all of this.
Thank you.
I suppose I should conclude by asking you, what is the legacy of Nuremberg? Here we are at a 3-day conference, a whole lot of talent, and we'll be learning a lot here in the next couple of days. But as you reflect on it, what is it?
Well, it's what we want it to be, and it's what we need it to be. We need to have international criminal justice as part of our international society. We're in the age of globalization. You know, you can pick up a cell phone and call China. You can put a stamp on an envelope and it'll go to Timbuktu, where you can use a piece of plastic and get money from around the globe. You have instant news. It's impossible to say that we will have all of that, but no, we're not going to have international criminal justice. A few years ago, my institute did a study that I directed of the number of conflicts since World War II. And we tallied from 1948 to 1998, 251 conflicts, which produced, at a minimum estimate, 70 million casualties, and at the highest estimate, 170 million casualties. Over 95% of the perpetrators have gone with impunity. We need international criminal justice. We need it because hopefully it will be a deterrent. Hopefully it will be an element of prevention. Hopefully it will bring closure to the victims. Hopefully we will be able to record history, and it will be a way of teaching future generations, and it will contribute to peace. We haven't done so, and we haven't done so because the political will isn't there, because there's a lot of realpolitik that doesn't want international criminal justice. Politicians want to settle things. They want to make deals. They want to have political settlements. And you know what? If the price of the political settlement is to give a pass to a terrible dictator or a warlord, they'll do it. I mean, the most recent example is Afghanistan. The United States has gone to Afghanistan, worked with the warlords because that suited our purpose, and in exchange the warlords got total impunity for 30 years of terrible things they did to their people. So this is the perennial conflict. Nuremberg was an extraordinary set of circumstances in which the four major allies, later joined by 19 other states established this tribunal by virtue of a treaty. They controlled the territory completely. Germany had unconditionally surrendered. So they could do whatever they want. This was extraordinarily unique circumstances. Never would you have a situation like that again. But it showed what could be done if the political will is there. People sometimes look at the inside of the courtroom, but they don't realize that the reason that Nuremberg was chosen is because it was the only city in Germany that had a courtroom standing. Everything else was devastated. Nothing existed. In fact, the seat of the IMT was supposed to be Berlin, but it was moved to Nuremberg because of the facility that was there. And so think, if you could, if you had a picture in front of you of a totally devastated Germany, you know, a country that's literally rubble, entirely rubble. This little building standing in there. And within this building, the creation of an international institution. And it's a catch-us-catch-can game. You know, nobody really knows what the next step is. And everything is a difficulty. The country is totally devastated. There's difficulty with light, there's difficulty with getting water, there's difficulty with getting heating, difficulty with getting food. Of course, the United States contingent had to rely on the U.S. Army. So, you know, whether or not the U.S. Army would consider that a priority and the resources they allocated. So here's Jackson, who's former Attorney General, Justice of the Supreme Court, and, you know, here he is in Nuremberg. He has to cajole the Army, in a sense, because he needs the Army to support and bring him what he has. He needs to deal with the politicians in Washington, and especially with the White House. He's got to deal with the French, the Russians, the Brits. He's got to help them because they don't have the same resources as the U.S. He has problems of language, problems of every possible type of problem. He faced those problems, if I can say so, in a very gentlemanly fashion. Sort of, again, if you would put the image and the figure of this man in the midst of this devastated context in Germany, it would be totally out of place. But here he was, as always, impeccably dressed and well-groomed and well-behaved and very polite and having to probably control his temper with all of the difficulties he was facing. And it was well, how do we solve this problem today? So the menu of the day were a number of problems, and how do you solve them? And that's what he had to go through. I think when you're in the midst of that type of a battle where you have difficulty keeping your head above water, you don't really think that far. The only thing that guides you is your conviction, you know, and your determination. You're going to do it, and you're determined, and you go on doing it. But, you know, you've got to keep the head above water. And it's one day after another. It's one step after another. So I think this is what happened. In the final analysis, Nuremberg left a good legal legacy. It left a legacy of a good due process of law. It was not a perfect one, but precisely because it was so good in light of the circumstances that it acquired so much more value. Its weakness, of course, is that it only prosecuted the defeated. It didn't prosecute anybody else. But that doesn't mean that the defeated didn't deserve being prosecuted. They did. And the fact that the victorious weren't prosecuted does not mean that the prosecution of the defeated was unfair. It was not unfair. And I think in the course of time, its significance is more its moral legacy. it's what we want it to be, because we need international criminal justice. And we need to look back and say, you see, even in the worst of times, and after this terrible war, we were able to have a system of justice that functioned.
This is terrific. Thank you. You've
Thank
been
you,
just
Greg.
terrific.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing all that you do for the good of
you're welcome.
international law.
Thank you. Great.